A little bit about my background. I have been in healthcare for over 20 years now in different facets. I started off my career in organizational development for a large health system. Then I worked predominantly in operations, running physician practices for the bulk of my career, moved into management consulting. And there I had the opportunity to do healthcare management consulting, but also to take on an inclusion and diversity leadership role inside of the consulting organization. That eventually led me to creating a commercial practice, which is called the Inclusion and Health Equity Practice, that was focused on helping organizations begin to think strategically about how they solve the problem of health equity, diversity, and inclusion. That then led me to the Institute for Diversity and Health Equity at the American Hospital Association. So that was a really great perspective to be able to see across the country and what was going on in different markets and with different healthcare systems um, with regard to this type of work. I have had a really great career inside of organizations, and now I'm on an entrepreneurial journey. And so I've started an organization called the Just Health Collective, and we are a consulting and advisory services firm that's again focused on advancing health equity and belonging in health and healthcare. So today's learning objectives for this program are to define belonging and its relevance in improving organizational performance, to understand the business case for belonging, and finally to take 5 actions to create and sustain a culture of belonging. So I like to start with this definition, and Renee mentioned this, but the intersection of diversity, equity, and inclusion is really belonging. And for quite some time, we've been focused on diversity and inclusion, and equity has become an increasingly important part of how we solve and create spaces of belonging. So when we think about those three things collectively in the intersection of that, that is what I define as belonging. So let's talk a little bit about why this is important, why even have a discussion around belonging. So I'd like to start with a definition here. So the end goal for creating an inclusive workplace is really to create a sense of belonging for everyone. And this quote is really a great summary of that evolution of our diversity and inclusion thinking. Diversity is having a seat at the table. Equity is ensuring that the table and chairs accommodate all, and inclusion is having a voice. But ultimately, it's the intersection of these things, belonging, that will unlock the power and promise of tomorrow. Foundationally, just to level set with everyone, when I think about diversity, I really think about all of the components that you see in this diagram. And in fact, I think about them as intersections. So each one of us has unique characteristics that define us. And we're not just one thing, we are multiple things. And so we have a tendency, particularly in this country, to focus on race and to focus on gender. And part of that is really rooted in our own issues as a country and the struggles that we've had to overcome in terms of racism and patriarchy. But when we think about inside of your organizational cultures, you really want to consider all of these things: the cognitive process, the physical things that you can see, the values, beliefs, practices, religion that a person may have, societal, economic status, political affiliations, work experience, tenure at an organization, the type of work that you do, and then your relational piece, how you relate to others, and who makes up your circle. So I also like to talk a little bit about the difference between equality and equity. Equality means that everyone is given a bike. And on the surface, this sounds great, but it's not exactly fair, because if we look closer, we see that different people may need different things or different bikes in order to be really successful and to achieve what they're trying to achieve. So equity sounds fair, or I'm sorry, equality sounds fair, but equity is actually fair. And the inclusion piece is really about the space that we create for everyone to feel valued, to feel respected, and is based off of expectations that we create together as teams around collaboration, transparency, respect, and equity. So, why does belonging matter? I'd like to tell you a brief story here. So, a week ago, before she was killed in a tragic car accident, Marina Keegan penned this essay in the Yale News special edition that was distributed to the class of 2012's commencement exercises. When she died, had just graduated from Yale, and this passage from the essay reminds us that all of us, yes, all of us, crave this feeling of belonging. Of course, there's a business case for cultivating belonging. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But it's really crucial to remember that this is a desire to belong that is innate in all of us. Belonging matters to us as individuals, it matters to us in how we relate to individuals and how we relate to and within our collective society. Each of us probably can remember a time where we didn't really truly feel like we belonged, and then times where we did belong. And certainly the emotions that you feel around those situations remind you of why belonging matters. So, when we think about the business case for belonging, there's really a lot of research and evidence that points to companies outperforming profitability based off of the diversity that they have. So, teams that are more gender diverse and more ethnically diverse have been shown to outperform in terms of profitability. Additionally, when we think about the job seekers in the market, they're often looking at your organization and evaluating whether or not they feel like they belong. 67% of job seekers said that a diverse workforce was important when evaluating organizational offers. And 57% of employees think that their organization needs to do more in order to increase diversity at work. Belonging also improves team collaboration, and that is foundationally built based off of inclusive leadership principles. So, why does it matter that you become an inclusive leader? So, the same research that was done at Deloitte found that leaders who exhibit inclusive behaviors create a difference of approximately 70% increase in their team's feelings of inclusion. That leads to improved team performance, increase in decision-making quality, and ultimately team collaboration. So how do we know that inclusion is actually valuable, that belonging is valuable? Well, this organization, Inclusion Inc., has what's called the Global Inclusion Index. And they have done studies with organizations around the world. And what they found is that if you are attracting new and diverse talent, what they're looking for is this type of feedback or this type of inclusion. I'm asked my opinion. My manager listens to me. My manager provides feedback to let me know my ideas, suggestions, and recommendations were considered. I participate in the decision-making process that affects my job, and I feel like I belong. So these are the 5 things that across the globe have been consistent that employees say they want and need, which really centers the conversation around belonging and why it's important. Belonging is also about creating psychological safety. So you may have heard a little bit more about this concept, but what it really is about is creating a space where 1, people feel included, 2, they feel safe to learn, so that when they ask questions or when they experiment or take on new projects, that it's okay to make a mistake and it's considered learning and not something punitive. Next, they feel safe to contribute, meaning when they're a part of a team, they feel like they can speak up and that what they have contributed is actually valued in the context of the team's decision making process. And finally, there's a feeling of that it's safe to challenge the status quo. So there's not going to be any retribution if you speak out um, to really challenge what has been, all in an effort to improve the organization. So ultimately, psychological safety leads to stimulating innovation in your work environment. And I think innovation is clearly a part of where all organizations are trying to get. We want to continually uh, innovate and rethink of how we go about things. And in order to do that, we have to create these psychologically safe organizations that are rooted in belonging. So, when we think about belonging in the healthcare setting, we also think about how this change can impact and be inflected across care delivery organizations or across health plans. And there are really three levels that we consider. First, the individual patient level, which is about whether or not the patient feels trust for your healthcare organization, whether or not they are going to adhere to treatment, and whether or not, because of how they feel about your organizations, they may have delays in uh, going to seek out care. The next is about the relational process or the care interaction process itself. And it's related to how providers interact with your patients. And it really goes into the concept of stereotyping and unconscious bias and racism that actually happens inside of our organization that ultimately has an impact on clinical decision making and communication that happens in between the patient provider relationship. And then finally, we're talking about systemic level factors. So this is really about the institution and how it functions in total, and understanding that every institution in this country has some level of systemic racism within which it operates, and that it may be hard for different populations, for instance, non-English speaking or English as a second language, um, populations like the LGBTQI community, who may experience difficulty in navigating and getting the right type of care and ensuring that they, again, are included and feel a sense of belonging when interacting with your organization. So, belonging is really about fostering inclusivity within our communities if we think about it from the healthcare perspective. Dr. Jennifer Mears at Northwell Health stated, having a workforce that reflects the diverse cultures and ethnicities and the diverse lifestyles of the community has helped us formalize strategies to be a much more inclusive healthcare system. So Northwell Health is actually in New Jersey. They're probably one of the leading organizations when it comes to belonging and health equity in our space. And so they see this as a key business strategy by which every person in the organization understands how it connects into their jobs, their roles, how it impacts strategy, how it impacts operations, and ultimately how it impacts the care that is delivered not only to the patient inside of their four walls, but to the community, and how we move upstream to address some of the factors such as social determinants of health that ultimately impact a community and population's health. So, what are some of the barriers to belonging? First, unconscious bias, systemic racism, unrecognized privilege, limited understanding of inclusive leadership behaviors, and lack of psychological safety. So, you likely heard of unconscious or implicit bias. This is something that all of us have. Um, and these are the mental shortcuts that we make in order to determine and help us make decisions about certain things. So sometimes these biases can take hold even when, if we thought about it, we think a different way, but we're so automatically conditioned to take in information and make perceptions and decisions on it. It's just an automatic response. So an example would be if you're walking down the street and it's dark, and you're walking through a dark alley, and in the distance you may see a person who appears to be homeless. And in your mind, what is happening is your heart may start to race. You may tighten your grip on your purse or whatever else you may be holding. And so this subconsciously is happening, even though you may realize that homeless people are more likely to be attacked than to attack you. But that is your unconscious bias at play. And unconscious bias can really float across all these different types of dimensions. So if we think back to the diversity dimension, this is very similar. Unconscious bias can show up in whether or not a person is married, their role or level within your company, their education, their religion. All of these places, unconscious bias can present itself. Now I want to talk a little bit about systemic racism, because systemic racism, one, has been clarified by the CDC just as of this week as a root cause of health inequity and really an emergency public health crisis. So we really have to lean into understanding how systemic racism has impact. So this diagram is called the lens of systemic oppression. And so racism occurs at both an individual and systemic level. In order to deconstruct racism, we have to then look at both individual or person level, the institution or organizational level, and then the structural level, which deals with institutions, laws, policies, the history of our country, how that all interacts. And so at an institution level, it's really important that we evaluate the disparate impact of policies, procedures, and process. Individually, it's important that we educate people about unconscious bias, about systemic racism, and how it all works collectively to create these systems of oppression that ultimately are impacting health. So now I'd like to show you a brief video about privilege, which is one of the other things that can become a barrier if it's not recognized.
Some people are born into families where they have to walk miles just to get water. All I have to do is turn on a faucet. That's privilege.
Ever tried to change your speech, if you were embarrassed about your clothes or house, if you would never think twice about calling the police when trouble occurs?
I think privilege is when some people have some things and other people don't have things.
I feel privilege is something that you don't even really have control over.
I think it'd be silly for me to say I don't have a fair amount of privilege, considering like the country I live in and the job I get to do and the college I was allowed to go to.
I suppose being a white male will help me end up somewhere towards the front, but I'll take a few steps back from being gay.
I don't think I'll make it to the front. I think I'll maybe be in the middle. That's just the gut feeling I have.
If your parents work nights and weekends to support your family, take one step back. If you can show affection for your romantic partner in public without fear of ridicule or violence, take one step forward. If you were embarrassed about your clothes or house while growing up, take one step back. If you have ever been diagnosed as having a physical or mental illness or disability, take one step back. If you have ever been bullied or made fun of based on something you can't change, take one step back. If you get time off for your religious holidays, take one step forward. If you came from a supportive family environment, if you can see a doctor whenever you feel the need, if you are able to move through the world without fear of sexual assault, if you took out loans for your education, if there were more than 50 books in your house growing up. So these are your final positions.
I think it felt kind of strange for everyone.
It's a hard thing to discuss or even reflect on.
It was very awkward.
I think when you can represent it so visually like this and so immediately, it definitely takes on a new form.
I think we were like all joking around in the beginning. It was pretty lighthearted, and as soon as the questions started coming in, the mood shifted immediately, and we all it was just silent.
Just looking back and seeing like a bunch of people behind you is not a good feeling.
It's like weird how you want to like hold on to explaining a certain privilege. Like, oh, but that's not actually me because like I had to work really hard for that. So it's weird to like take a step forward when you feel like you're taking a step forward with someone else, but you wear a lot of the baggage of like how those things were hard.
It was like more emotional than I thought it would be.
It reminded me of when they talk about slavery in high school and you feel like angry for a few days, but then you just realize like, this is how it is.
For me, it was kind of frustrating almost to look back and see how much further some people were behind me, and realizing that, you know, a lot of that stuff, no amount of hard work or even legislation can make up that gap.
It's interesting being an Asian American because you're not really sure where you fall on the spectrum of privilege.
I know that for me, one of the reasons I ended up so far back was that there are questions around safety as an African American, as a woman, as a gay woman. There are just so many different ways that I don't feel safe.
I feel like I just learned to be grateful for what you have. You know, we're in such a huge society where it's always complaining about what you don't have.
It just shows you that for some families, like each family, you're meant to do better. My grandparents did good, my parents did good, and I'll do even better.
I do think if you're not like aware of privilege, you should do this exercise, but it's more complicated.
So that's always a pretty powerful video. And I've actually completed that in person. And I remember sitting with the feeling of just, it brings to attention the things that I have worked to overcome as a Black person, as a member of the LGBTQ community. And what you see happening in that video is that there's separation. These privilege can start to separate people. And when it becomes a problem is when it's unrecognized and taken for granted, and those with certain privileges don't stop to recognize and try to make space and room and support others who may not have the same privileges. So it becomes a barrier again in trying to create these cultures of belonging. And one of the best things that you can do is begin to talk about what the concept of privilege means. And a lot of times people get stuck on white privilege. White privilege is just one component of privilege. And I think to really help people contextualize, you have to help them understand that all of us generally have some element of privilege. For instance, us sitting behind this computer today with our internet and our computer screens is a form of privilege.
Some people.
So the definition here is privilege is a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group of people. So if you don't have to think about it, that's privilege. So now I want to switch gears a bit and talk about traits of inclusive leaders, because without these traits in the skill set and competencies of your leaders, then you are likely to have some challenge with creating spaces of belonging. So inclusive leaders work actively to visibly show and demonstrate their commitment to diversity, inclusion, and equity. They also tend to approach from a very humble perspective, wanting to understand and empower others. They likely have an awareness of their own bias, their own privilege. They have a curiosity that keeps them open-minded, and they're listening without judgment as they interact with others around them. They also have a cultural intelligence, meaning that they're aware and very attentive to the culture of others and how that culture may have impact or may have dissonance, in fact, in environments that they are leading. And then finally, they are skilled at creating psychological safety because they understand its benefits and how it can help form cohesive teams. So I really like this quote because it puts the onus of change squarely in our lives as individuals. We alone don't have the ability to really construct change within ourselves. But much of the work that is actually required to become an inclusive leader is really about self-awareness. It's about honesty and it's about truth telling. So what do you believe, and this is just a rhetorical question, but what do you believe in the course of 2020 was what you told yourself about social unrest and the killing of unarmed Black people that was occurring in 2020? Were you really honest about your own complicity in actually upholding an invisible system of oppression and racism? Maybe you were one of those people who said, you know, this is about others needing to change. It's about the police needing to change, but it's really not about me. But the reality is we are all complicit in some way, shape, or form. So it's really up to us to be honest with ourselves, or our organizations and broader society will actually continue to suffer. People will continue to suffer, and we'll really never perform at the level that we're supposed to. So we are the primary obstacle to the very future we're committed to creating. And your organization will never perform at a level higher than its own consciousness of its leadership. So now I want to do a quick interactivity. So some of you may have done this before. What I'd like you to do is to either open your phone or go to the web address polev.com. That's polev.com. And you're going to enter the code JHC 2021. It may ask you if you want to remain anonymous, feel free. But try these steps. I'll give you just a moment, and then we'll move into the actual poll questions. And I think Gina put the link actually in the chat, so that's great. You can just click there. Okay. So now the poll is activated and you should be able to answer the questions. This first question. In a few words, how did you feel during a time when you knew you didn't belong? The code is JHC 2021. I'm seeing something in the chat. Just a sec. All right. I was afraid I might have a little bit of trouble here. Give me one moment. Been having some technical difficulties with Paul everywhere. So I'm gonna go into my account really quick and see if I can adjust there. Okay, are you able to put in answers yet?
Not yet, Duane.
No.
Okay. Try this a slightly different way. Anyone able to get in yet? Okay.
Yeah.
At Duane, it still says web voting is not available for this poll or hasn't been turned on.
All right. And what we will do is take a different route here. All right. So I apologize for that. Let's actually go into the chat. And if you wouldn't mind just sharing your answer in the chat. So in a few words, how did you feel during a time when you knew you didn't belong? Nervous, othered, sad, lonely, anxious, uncomfortable, insecure, shame, invisible, isolated. Exactly. So all these feelings, if you think about it, when you're in an environment like work, where you spend a great majority of your time, if you don't feel that you belong, how might that actually impact your engagement in the work that you do? How might it impact the interactions that you have with your coworkers? And so the next question up here is the opposite. So when you felt that you did belong at a certain point, what did that feel like? Free, empowered, at ease, liberated, motivating, happy, authentic, love that, exhilarating, connected, comfortable, and happy. Excellent. And I actually, on the last one, as I was looking over, it said something about not feeling like you wanted to be alive. So I just want to, pause on that one, because there is some truth in when people don't feel that they belong, they will be impacted from a mental health perspective, want to isolate themselves, and potentially may want to take their own lives. So it really can be an issue of life or death in some situations when you are constantly in an environment where you feel like you don't belong. Okay. And on the flip side, you're more likely to contribute and to be able to be authentic in your relationships with people when you feel a sense of belonging. So now let's just shift and talk about some of the actions that you can take to really create this culture of belonging. The first is building a case for belonging, then addressing unconscious bias, either at an individual or organizational level, being aware of the micro messages that you might be sending, building an inclusive team, and finally addressing systemic racism. So building the case for belonging is really about creating the value proposition. And I've identified 6 things that you can use to begin to create that value proposition and message that you're communicating to others to help them understand, its importance. First, we've talked about organizational performance. A lot of data out there that can help you make that case. It's been studied over and over again that diversity and inclusion actually improves organizational performance. Team collaboration, the ability to, once you have diversity at the table, to hone in on its strengths and the value that it can bring to collaborative decision-making, attracting new and diverse talent that is oftentimes looking for organizations where they feel like they can fit, creating psychological safety and innovation, reducing health inequity, or if you're outside of healthcare, reducing inequity in general. And then finally, building community trust and connection, which becomes so important and relevant to managing populations. Next, addressing your unconscious bias. So again, this occurs at an individual level where you're thinking about increasing your own self-awareness and understanding how bias can impact you and others, having discussions with people who are different than you so that you can learn and learn where your biases are and how to perhaps interrupt those biases. And then attending trainings like this one, where you get more foundational knowledge that allows you to not only learn for yourself, but begin to share and teach others. On the organizational side, this means that you're looking for bias as it shows up in things like your hiring practices, compensation. We know that there's a major gender gap in terms of compensation of women versus men. Implementing regular surveys can help you gather the feedback necessary to understand where bias may be occurring. And then again, providing training on these concepts and giving people the opportunity to talk about and understand their own bias. Next, being aware of the micro messages that you might be sending. And these micro messages are tiny, covert, unintentional actions that really adversely may impact a person or group that is perceived to be different. It can show up in the things that we say or the things that we do. For instance, one microaggression that has come to be more commonly known is that telling an African American person or another person of color that they're articulate could mean that you're assuming or surprised that an African American or person of color could actually be articulate. So it's generally perceived as a microaggression for those communities. But there are many, many different types of microaggressions, again, that can occur across many of the elements of diversity that we talked about before. Building an inclusive team. So this means leaning into diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, dedicating resources to help people understand how to implement diversity, equity, and inclusion, promoting a culture where leadership is seeking feedback about DEI. Also addressing structural inequities in the talent management process. So paying attention to the statistics of your talent management funnel. So if you have agreed to say, we're going to make the pipeline as diverse as possible, well, as that pipeline moves forward in the process to each subsequent phase of interviews, you may start to have people fall out. And you want to know the statistics around who is falling out, because that could mean that bias is present. Next, keeping diversity, equity, and inclusion on an executive agenda. So making sure that this is front and center when leadership thinks about its strategy and its culture. Finally, addressing structural racism. So this is something we can no longer hide from. We particularly must look at institutional racism, the policies and procedures and process, looking at policies for disparate impact. And the way that you can do that is to invite those who are part of marginalized communities to really help you understand if disparate impact is present. Also creating your own lens for which to view these policies from a DEI perspective. Reviewing clinical decision-making criteria, making sure that you're collecting race, ethnicity, language, sexual orientation, gender identity data, and then thinking about the actual process flow for some of these patients that come into your organization. So that's really about the institution itself. And then thinking about individual behaviors and actions. The goal is to become anti-racist. So there's really three levels. There's racist, non-racist, and anti-racist. Non-racist is, you have beliefs that racism is wrong, but you may not actually speak up or do anything about it. Whereas anti-racist is you are taking an active position to try and dismantle structural racism. And you're moving through this fear zone, learning zone, and growth zone. And I invite you to take a look at this. I know we'll send the slides out to really figure out where you are. And if you find yourself in fear or learning, You need to continue to reach out and gather more information, have more discussion, read more books to really move yourself to that growth zone. So I really want to present you all with this information from Amanda Gorman, who was the poet who spoke at the presidential inauguration. It really spoke to me, particularly the last part. And so we lift our gazes not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future first, we must first put our differences aside. And regardless of all of the divisiveness that we have going on in our country, we have to continue to lean in, to call people into the conversation so that we can come to a better understanding of our shared humanity, which will reconnect us to trying to build environments of belonging. So to wrap us up here, I'd like you to again share in the chat one word that describes your impression of today's session. What are you left feeling? And one action that you intend to take based off of what you learned and as a result of that feeling. Okay, heavy-hearted. Yeah, this type of work can do that for sure. Empowered, vulnerable, hopeful, inspired, fantastic, hopeful, seen, introspective, urgency. Excellent. Well, that's exactly where you should be. What you feel today is exactly what you should feel. And then think about, what are you going to do differently to move to a space where we feel optimistic, where we feel that we've succeeded in moving organizations and society forward. So thank you so much for your time today. And I think we're going to take some questions now.
Thank you so much, Duane. That was really great, really powerful. And we have one question in the chat. Monica Soni, are you able to unmute yourself and ask your question aloud?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. You know, one of the things I've been reflecting about is the power of words and the terms that we use. And I've started to step away from the term microaggression because at times it feels dismissive, right? If you have a repeated microaggression or it's prevalent or pervasive, it's no longer experienced as micro, right? Like it's a macro experience. And just wondering if, you know, again, since folks are thinking about taking this back to their institutions, are there some alternative terms we can use in that space instead that might feel less minimizing to some folks?
Yeah, you know, microaggressions can also be microaffirmations. So I want to make sure I bring that to the front. So microaffirmations are the positive. But really what it is slights that ultimately impact how people feel in the environment. And, you know, there's so much language out there around these things, but I think the really important part is what you say and how people perceive it matters, right? And even if you don't realize that you have harmed someone in some way, it still has impact. And so if you want to improve, then you need to get feedback about some of the unconscious bias that you might carry. You need to invite people to provide feedback to you if ever you say something that comes across as offensive. So I think it's really important to focus on the how versus the what. So making sure that you're moving through and understanding that conceptually this is a problem, if it causes pain, discomfort, disrespect to individuals, and then thinking about, well, how do I fix that?
Thanks.
Welcome.
Yusuf, would you like to ask your question aloud?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for this awesome presentation. So wanted to hear if you had a specific case example of an organization or individuals that have moved toward becoming anti-racist that you've worked with, and how they actually operationalized it, and either successes or barriers they had.
Yeah, well, you know, I really wish that I could tell you that there's an organization that has this right now, but the reality is we are just in this period of awakening still, and there are organizations that are taking it on. So I can tell you that we have worked with a large health system that is, it's a national health system. So they have about 80 hospitals across the country. We worked with their senior most leadership team. And we went through a series of workshops with them, giving history around anti-racism or systemic racism, what it is, how it impacts healthcare. But we also, what I noticed is that we had to go into how individually people feel about these things, their interpretation of their own selves vis-a-vis being racist. And you know, part of it is helping them understand that racism isn't a journey and label that you always hold. Racism is a behavior and it's an action. So you can come in and out of racist behaviors and actions. But what we did was help them understand their own internal feelings and how they showed up in situations. We then helped them understand from the perspective of minorities, a few of whom were on their team, what their experience has been. I mean, really getting deep into some powerful experiences that help people center empathy. And so this particular organization, they're on their journey, but I'll tell you, they had some very tough conversations. They had some tense moments, but they leaned into what they were doing. And as a result, somebody mentioned this heavy feeling. As a result, they felt heavy, and that if they didn't, as a leadership team, respond to this, they could not hold their heads high about the service that their organization was providing to their communities. And so that was the beginning of their journey. And now, you know, they brought in a chief inclusion officer. They are, you know, beginning to roll this out across their organization. I mean, that's the beginning, though. I always think that it has to start with the top leadership really understanding their own individual selves and how we fit into a larger system.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Next question, Betsy, can you unmute yourself?
Duane, for such an important presentation, and we have to keep this conversation going. And you know, all of us here are leaders in our own standing, in our own organizations. We're very culturally diverse, and our organization are all at different maturity level. And I'm looking to you, perhaps through your wisdom, collectively, what can we do together? Because together we can really impact change. But if we all go into our separate ways, the change impact is minimal. I really look to your recommendation. If there's one thing you wish a strong cohort or healthcare leader can impact change, what would you like to see?
Well, and I actually think that you all, there's a collaborative, and Renee, you may need to help remind me of the name, but there's going to be some sort of collaborative that you all are working towards some of this work. But I think grounding yourself, if nothing else, grounding yourself in the history of racism to understand its implications today is really critical, because a lot of times people who don't understand what happened in the past just assume that, you know, communities that are marginalized are asking for something more or something, you know, that is unfair to other populations. But if you really understand the history and understand how the history still has hold on what is happening today, then it becomes less about the person and more about the system that is at play. And if you can move people from their individual thoughts about racism and their individual guilt, then you can start to focus on the system. And collectively, as organizations, you have power to change policy in your local, state, even federal government. If you start to understand that a particular policy has a very disparate impact on communities that are oppressed.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And then Duane will do one last question, which is from David TM. David, can you unmute yourself?
David?
I can. Hi, good morning, and thank you for this wonderful presentation. My question's about, I guess, the timing of this work and framing of this work. And so organizations are often motivated by budgets or metrics that are shorter term, and often, the returns on investment in DEI work and belonging work seem like they can be further out because they require nurturing, culture change, and so forth. And I was wondering if you had advice on how to nudge organizations to value this work when they may be focused, on a 12-month budget cycle, for instance, as opposed to the longer term.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that question. I think you're absolutely right. Sometimes we get sort of myopic about what is happening now. And certainly, organizations right now are still dealing with COVID. And that has been something that has taken attention away from, the social unrest issue. But I think talking about its benefit to the organization and quantifying that in certain ways. So particularly on the health equity side, understanding that when you have gaps and disparities, you also likely have patients that are showing up to the ED, that have higher lengths of stay, that have readmission, et cetera, quantifying that piece. On the DEI side, I think you have to use the moment that we're in as opportunity. We're still in the very thick of this. Things are happening just this week. And without a focus here, we're not going to be able to fix this. And we're going to run into further problems. Your employees are a part of a broader society, and this has impact on them. So as an organization, you have responsibilities to your employees. And this is yet another responsibility that you must take on for the benefit of your employees to actually be able to function healthy in your organization, to have wellness, to feel engaged in your organization. And there are some more sort of short-term process metrics that you can start to look at, like, do you have employee resource groups? Do you have a diversity and inclusion council? Have you done certain elements of training? And then tying questions in your employee engagement survey to the things like I pointed out that were used as global questions across countries to understand how your employees feel. Even if it's a short pulse survey, that is helpful. I also think the power of a person or individual with the lived experience telling their story can help to change and keep people engaged. If you tap into their heart empathy, then likely they're going to give a bit of space while you're trying to solve the long-term outcome and improve what is cultural over time.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Duane. Really appreciated having you at the presentation, all the really great questions. Round of applause. Yes. Absolutely. If you're able to stay on for a few minutes, that's great. We have another session that'll be starting at 10:15. So we'll need to start preparing for that presenter at 5 minutes after the hour. But if you want to take a break, get away from Zoom for a few minutes, we'll see everyone else back here at 10:15. Thank you. Is there someone else who has a question that wants to ask Duane?
I asked Duane a question.
Yeah, of course. Hi, Lisa.
Hey. So Duane, I really appreciated your work. I work at a student health center, and we're neophytes on our journey for anti-racism efforts. We've done that privilege walk. We've had students talk about their experiences, with racism when our students were protesting with George Floyd. We've done a number of things in terms of training. We're going to get someone in from the university to train us more so on implicit bias too as well. But the leadership, I just feel like they're not at the same level. They're white females. They have their own nucleus. I don't know if they need an additional training, but I've had so much resistance with trying to get things going, presenting and whatnot. And it's very frustrating. I just don't understand it. I mean, I understand it, but I can't understand why they don't want to. There's so much resistance with this. Learning institution.
Yes. Well, sometimes our learning institutions need to learn a lot themselves. But what I would say is that people are in a space of fear. White people in particular are fearful of what they don't understand and know, and fearful of being blamed. They're guilty. They're feeling guilty. And so I think we have to create spaces to call them into the conversation and let them know those emotions are okay. What's not okay is that we stay where we are. And I think it behooves all of us to begin to draw a line to say it is just absolutely imperative that we try to move through this. And we know that we're going to have challenge. We know that people are going to come from very different spaces about their feelings around this, but collectively we have to agree that this is not okay, because it has impact on our students. It has impact on our faculty. And here are the stories that we can share around that. But I think, I love the concept of calling people in, which means having a conversation in private and really expressing not only, what the student perspective is, but what your perspective is and how this is actually making you feel in the environment. And inviting that person to open up and share with you, and giving them a bit of grace to at least start the conversation. But now is the time so what we've done for a very long time, meaning people of color, particularly Black Americans, is to keep our mouths closed so that we do not become a target, so that we can just try to survive without being bothered in the work environment, right? That time has passed for us as well. Like, now is the time to, in the most constructive way that you can, indicate that you're not okay, and what you're seeing and observing is not okay. And we have to be committed to doing something about it, bringing them other examples of other institutions that are moving in this way. So it's a tough space to be in, but bringing them in and sharing your own story helps.
Mm-hmm. And personally, I feel like there is a target on my back. Oh.
Yeah. And what's also important for you, Lisa, is to make sure that you have a network. Is she?